Welcome to Echoes in the Gallery. I am your host, Susan L. Sistrunk. As an arts educator and professional artist, it is my privilege to bring you my first original podcast set in a series of volumes. Each episode will air weekly on Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and wherever you get your podcasts. Episode 25, Chaos in the Chihuahuan Desert. 30 minutes prior to the explosion at the Sandman Motel, things took a turn south. The stifling air made the room unbearable. Rachel and Jonathan were tied to chairs in a small motel room with Ivanov's guard watching over them. "Wow, really?" Rachel said sarcastically. "Aren't you bored yet?" He had already beaten them both up repeatedly, and Jonathan was now missing his pinky finger along with the nails from both hands. To his credit, Jonathan had kept his mouth shut about the location of the diamonds. The guard had seemed a little more squeamish when it came to women, though, and just punched Rachel all over her body until she began to cough up blood. She was still mouthing away, though. If this guy was going to kill her, Rachel wasn't going down without a war of words at the very least. During this time, she had been struggling to free her bonds and almost had one hand free. She had a plan. It was a long shot, but anything was better than sitting here waiting to die. The guard's phone rang during a break in the beatings. "Yes, boss?" It must be Ivanov on the line. "I will keep an eye out. According to the map on the wall, the room is right across from this one. I will know if they move." He stayed on the phone for a few more minutes. During this time, Rachel managed to get one of her hands free. As her captor faced the window, Rachel made eye contact with Jonathan, showing him the new development of one of her hands free. She shook her head in a motion for him to be quiet. The conversation with Ivanov needed to finish before she made her move. They couldn't risk anyone knowing if she and Jonathan somehow managed to get free. The guard had put his gun in the holster around his shoulder. Perhaps it would work. Rachel knew there was no room for hesitation. She needed the element of surprise. As soon as Rachel heard the phone call end, with the guard's back still turned, she literally leapt into action. With one hand freed and the other tied to the chair, Rachel swung the chair at her captor, landing a surprising blow to the side of his head. He was knocked over by the raging force from the unsuspected attack. There was no time to lose. As he was on all fours trying to regain his senses, Rachel slammed the chair against his head again, with Jonathan yelling her on. He used his legs and moved his chair over the man's head, the bottom rungs blocking his airway. Rachel reached for the man's gun. "No! Don't shoot him! We can't risk anyone hearing the shot," Jonathan hissed. Rachel grabbed a pillow to muffle the sound. With the air conditioner on full blast, she figured this would have to do and shot the guard in the chest. He immediately went still. "Oh, thank goodness! Get me loose!" Jonathan panted, wincing from the pain all over his body. "Just a minute. I need to get my arm off this chair." Rachel finished releasing herself from the armchair and picked up the gun, pointing it at Jonathan. "I'm sorry, but you really should have seen this coming." Before he could react, Rachel shoved the pillow on his face, muffling Jonathan's cries, and pulled the trigger. "Whew," she thought. "At least that was over. Now, time to get the diamonds." Rachel looked over the dead guard and found a knife around his ankle. She looked in his wallet and pulled out all the cash. Working for Ivanov must pay well, judging from the $100 bills stacked in there. Good. She would need the money. Using the guard's knife, she cut through Jonathan's shirt, sliced into the wound on his neck, and pulled out the bag of diamonds. Wow! That must have really been hurting like hell. It had taken up quite a bit of room inside his neck. Oh well, at least she didn't have to worry about Jonathan anymore. Time to get cleaned up. She had a little bit of time, judging from the conversation on the phone. But how to get out of here without attracting attention? And Ivanov was just across the road at the restaurant, with the other people in a room facing this one, only a small courtyard between them. She must assume they could identify her. Rachel needed a distraction. A quick shower later, a plan began to form. There was a propane tank out back which supplied the motel with hot water, and with a little luck, Rachel thought she could fit through the bathroom window. It was a first story, and a bush outside would hide her from the highway. She noticed some shrubbery around the propane tank. Oops, they really should have cleared that area. Rachel dressed hurriedly, put the diamonds and cash in her pockets, grabbed the guard's sunglasses and his ball cap, and squeezed out the window. The sun was setting, and she needed it to be just a little darker. Waiting under the cover of the bush, Rachel thought about Jonathan. It really was a pity, but she just couldn't have that dead weight hanging around her neck anymore. Jonathan had served his purpose. Now she could distract everyone and make it seem like she had died as well. With the darkness of the desert night enveloping her, Rachel crept to the back of the motel where the propane tank was located. She needed to be quick. It wouldn't do any good to go up in flames also. The brush caught in a hurry, and she ran as quickly as possible into the desert, getting about 50 yards before the propane tank exploded into the night sky. Looking back, she could tell the side where the room they had been in was completely engulfed in flames. There went Jonathan, the guard of Ivanov's, all the evidence of what had happened. Ivanov would assume she had died in the explosion. She needed to find a place to lay low tonight. Rachel began heading out into the desert toward the area of small adobe houses she had seen earlier on the way to the motel. They looked like vacation rentals. Maybe she could find one that was empty. Back at the restaurant, Jordan was trying to figure things out. Ivanov wasn't dead, but he was knocked out cold. The blast had left debris all over the floor of Lakiva. Jordan wiped his head, and blood stared back at him from his palm. Looking at the hotel, half of it was demolished. The right side was engulfed in flames. A fire truck coming down the road screeched to a halt in front as disoriented people began vacating the intact portion of the building. There might be a way out of this. Nobody except him knew Ivanov wasn't dead. What if... At that moment, Ivanov bolted awake, coughing, and Jordan's chance was lost to the wind. Now it would mean fighting him, and Jordan knew his psyche couldn't quite go that far. "What happened?" Ivanov finally gasped out. "The motel. Part of it blew up. Are you okay? I thought you were dead." "No such luck, kid." Ivanov stood up, looking coldly at the burning building. "Call Eric. Tell him to get back here. Now." When the building exploded, Tuturia and Sergei had been sleeping. The blast shook them awake on the second floor, and they awoke to all of the furniture falling over and the television crashing to the floor. "What the hell?" Sergei exclaimed. There were cracks now in the ceilings and walls. The door popped open. "I don't know, but we have to get out of here." Together they grabbed their belongings and rushed out the door. A fire truck was just arriving. They headed to the first vehicle they found and got inside. Pulling out in a hurry, Tuturia stepped on the gas, only to screech to a halt 30 feet later. Part of the road was blocked by blast from the debris, and the part that wasn't blocked was taken up by a furious Ivanov pointing a gun at the windshield of the car. "Out! Now!" he shouted furiously. The look on his face was without question. Tuturia looked in the rearview mirror and saw lights approaching. None of them could risk the police. There was a tap on the passenger side window. Jordan had a gun and, despite his urge to vomit, was pointing it at Sergei's face. He could only hope he was pulling it off. "Get out! The cops are coming!" They were all between a rock and a hard place. There was absolutely nothing to do but go with them. Tuturia and Sergei quickly hurried out of the vehicle and followed Ivanov and Jordan across the road to the restaurant. While the front of Lakiva had been blown out, the back was intact, and they rushed through to the private room in the back usually reserved for parties. "Now," Ivanov said evenly, after they were all seated, "where the hell is my money?" Eric and Gwen had been awoken with a start by Eric's cell phone. He had told Ivanov they would need at least 2 hours. It had only been 45 minutes. This couldn't be good. Gwen sat up and listened to Eric's part of the conversation. When would this all end? She put on her clothes and washed her face. Eric hung up and explained everything. As the two of them got ready to walk out the door, Eric stopped and pulled Gwen to him softly. His hands brushed her hair aside. She felt his lips touch her forehead and lifted her chin to meet his mouth with hers. I won't let anything happen to you, Gwen. I promise. This is almost over. She walked over to the door and opened it. Let's go. As her captor finished reading the last page of chapter 25, Victoria Graham waited with anticipation. The constant cold of the room had made sleep impossible for the unknown amount of time the tiny room in this presumably log structure had been her home. It had pacified him thus far. The cold, damp air smelled of mold. A small cot in the corner of the room was covered with a navy blanket and a moth-eaten comforter. Without any windows, time had become an abstract idea. Occasionally, Victoria heard a generator hum to life, and it reminded her that this was an actual structure and not something made up in her mind. Clinging to sanity had become a daily struggle. This was more and more appearing to be a hopeless situation. It was all that kept this unknown identity of a man from killing her. He had been very pleased with the development of Ivanov, even laughed at Jordan's ridiculousness in a haunting and uneasy fashion. Now, with the climax of the story approaching, what would she do? How could she keep this tale going in order to keep her usefulness alive to this person? Victoria had no idea how long she had been writing. The click of the typewriter had become a monotonous clacking pressing into her brain. She hadn't even seen a typewriter in years until entering this room. Stacked next to it were the fruits of her labor. How many days had she been here, bound to a small bed at night and typing away during the day? Her family must be worried sick. With averaging a chapter a day, it must be 27 days now. Victoria had resisted and refused at first, leading to beating, torture, and the eventual amputation of her pinky toe, which had been worked into the story by way of Jonathan, much to the delight of this man who now controlled her fate. Her eyes began to mist again as she watched the darkest brown gaze she had ever known rise up to meet her own. I am not happy with this. It is time for some training. And then the tears began to really flow, for Victoria knew what her punishment would be. The man, who must be at least 6'4", weighing probably 400 pounds, stood up and walked toward her from the corner. Victoria closed her eyes and began to pray. This concludes episode 25 of Echoes in the Gallery. Join me, your host, Susan L. Sistrunk, next week for episode 26, The Kidnapping of Victoria Graham, where we will find out more about our new heroine and her precarious situation. Until then, thank you for listening. Stay safe and love each other.